Now over to the chair.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this ERA webinar focusing on ethnicity and the early years workforce in maintained nursery schools across England. My name is Nikki Fairchild, and I'm one of the conveners of the Early Childhood Education and Care SIG. Today, I'm alongside Louise Kay and our other colleagues, Lewis Fogarty and Feng Yin Kang. We're really pleased to welcome Mona and Shaddai, who will present some of their insights on the ERA-funded research project entitled Ethnicity and the Early Years Workforce in Maintained Nursery Schools Across England. The focus of this project was to examine how staff ethnicity reflects or not the children served by nursery schools, and how staff ethnicity intersects with qualification levels and leadership responsibilities. The quantitative data will be elucidated through the qualitative research of Shaddai Tembo, which emphasises the need to make Black educator identity more visible in early years settings. Looking at Black early years educator experiences through the lenses of critical race theory can help to illuminate more what's happening in the sector. It's my pleasure to welcome the panel. Dr. Mona Sackett is a senior lecturer in education and early childhood. As a researcher in early years provision, she has recently published on creative digital and playful pedagogies. Mona's current research is an exploration of pedagogical, organisational and community leadership in early years, and how leadership can be more effectively developed through innovative practice-based and digitally mediated professional development. Her books include an introduction to social leadership, and there's a forthcoming edition on international perspectives in early years pedagogical leadership. Also works internationally and in the sector in the UK, and has developed very strong relationships with researchers, providers, memberships and advocacy organisations. Shaddai Tembo is a lecturer in Early Childhood Studies UK and China at Artsville University, and also an associate lecturer at the Open University. He's a trustee for early education and the Fatherhood Institute, and an independent writer and speaker through critical early years. Shaddai is also currently engaged in a research project funded by the Froebel Trust on developing an anti-racist framework within Froebelian pedagogy. I'd like to welcome you both and now hand over to you as presenters.
Thank you very much, Nikki, and to Louise and everyone at the BERA team for inviting us along to speak today. Mona and I are really excited to be with you and share the findings of this report. So let me go ahead and share my slides, and we'll get started with the presentation. I'm very conscious of the weather today. It's mighty hot out there, so do thank you for joining us this afternoon. Okay, so ethnicity and the early years workforce in maintained nursery schools across England. As Nikki said, the purpose of this event is really to talk through the project that Mona's been doing over the past year and share findings with you, as well as the rationale and the reports. I'm going to speak for the first 15 minutes or so, just to set the scene in terms of my study on Black educators in white settings in early childhood spaces. I'll share a bit about that and the broader context of why I came to write that article, which informs the project that Mona will then speak about in terms of the rationale, method and key findings. At the end of this session, we're going to open up to a Q&A and discussion. So we're really looking forward to hearing about the future of research in this field, where you think we might go next, and how we can continue to keep this conversation going around issues of ethnicity, race and racism within the early years. I want to start really by going back to my paper, Black Educators in White Settings, Making Racial Identity Visible in Early Childhood Education and Care in England, UK. This article was published in the summer of 2020 in the wake of the George Floyd's murder and the resurgent Black Lives Matter protests. It was incredibly timely in that sense, but it certainly wasn't written in that context. For me, questions around race and racial identity were circulating many years before. I came to write this paper specifically towards the end of 2018, off the back of the conference that I had just done with regards to men in the early years in Bristol. It was around this time I was thinking about questions of gender and gender identity and the role of men in the early years that, for me, thinking more intersectionally, there perhaps wasn't enough of a focus on race and racial identity. There was certainly a paucity of literature examining this issue, which led me to go away and research it for my master's subject. The purpose really here was to draw upon concepts of identity to make Black educator identity visible within the early years, and also contribute towards the broader movement towards Black studies within the UK. the work of Kahindi Andrews, Lisa Palmer. Kahindi Andrews had recently written the book Back to Black, which looked at mobilising Black studies and explored concepts of Blackness and identity and what that really meant for representation and the role of education in the early years. So for me, that was really, really important in establishing a sense of why this article needed to come to be when we look at the broader context. I initially started by looking not specifically at educator identity, not specifically at racial identity, but more broadly at the purpose of education per se, and what that can offer in terms of representation. For me, the work of Paulo Freire is incredibly influential. It's not insignificant that I go under the rubric of critical early years. His thinking and pedagogic approach towards early childhood and education as a whole, really, and situating that as a political space has been really, really important for me. So I wrote in the journal article that education can serve as an important vehicle for the political formation of citizens within a democratic society. Research consistently indicates having a teaching force that better represents society is critical because of the character, ubiquity, pervasiveness, duration, and importance of teaching as a social activity. Moving on from the importance of education as a political space, around this time I was beginning to write these articles, this journal article, we were seeing reports in the news about the role of Black educators in higher education, secondary and primary spaces. In higher education, there were reports coming out that there were just 85 Black professors out of 18,510. So it's not even 1%, that's half of 1%, which is incredibly striking when you compare that to the proportion of Black students in the UK, which is now at 6%. Furthermore, Black HE staff are statistically underrepresented in comparison to the UK population. In schools, the reports were shown by the Runnymede Trust that there was a chronic shortage of BME teachers in relation to the pupil population. And this is exacerbated according to leadership positions and gender, something that Maya will talk about in the report later on. In Bristol, where I was and have now moved back to, the report came out by Aisha Thomas, who had done some work around representation within the city, and she helped to contribute towards this report where it was found that there was just 26 Black teachers out of 1,346 in Bristol. I think I'll never forget that statistic because of how striking it is, especially for me living in Bristol, knowing what I know about how seemingly diverse it is as a city. But actually, when you scratch the surface and look at the level of segregation and issues of race and racism within teaching professions, there's clearly an issue there, and much more work needs to be done in particular areas where issues of race are not discussed at all, which leads to a lack of representation in the teaching profession. Aisha Thomas has recently published a brilliant book called Representation Matters that I'd really encourage you to check out. It's a really fantastic resource for teachers and educators to look at building an anti-racist pedagogy in practice. So that was higher education and schools, where we were seeing many reports about the lack of representation in the workforce. But what about Black educators in the early years? Again, perhaps to make a broader point here, whenever we look at reports in terms of education and representation, it always seems to be the early years that are missed off of those statistics. And that for me is really, really frustrating. Even when we look at the early years workforce strategy that was published in 2017, that does make explicit reference to the gender diversity of the profession, but there's no reference to racial diversity and the value that that could bring to enhancing children's experiences. I also felt that there were a number of broader factors at play in understanding the nature of representation and issues of race and racism in the early years, namely whiteness, where there was a silencing of discussion around these issues. Certainly in the past 2 years, the level of discourse and discussion has become much better in recognising and being able to challenge these issues. Before then, however, I don't think the conversations were anywhere near as significant. And there were certainly, when we look at the research, issues of silencing around race and racism. I also felt when we looked at the role of identity in early years environments, this notion of professional identity often seemed to work as a very neutralizing category, smoothing over the nature of individual difference among educators. When we as practitioners turn up to work every day, we don't leave our personal selves at the door. We bring that with us, and that's exciting because it brings new experiences to the children. But actually, this notion of professional identity often seemed to serve as a kind of neutral category, which often didn't recognise the individual racial or perhaps gendered identities of practitioners. Finally, in the research, we were seeing issues of tokenism and isolation among BME educators in the reports that were available on those experiences. I'm not going to go through all of my findings today. I really encourage you to read my paper in your own time, but I'll just share a small extract here and another one in the following slide from my interviews. This is me talking to Safi, and I'll just read it out to you now. So I say that, do you think conversations about race were happening before you arrived? Safi says, I don't think they were beforehand. I don't think so, because there wasn't an obvious thing to talk about. Because when I came and started, they were all firing questions at me, especially in the preschool, because they're older. They're so curious about my complexion, but I don't think they had seen a Black person before. I don't think they had seen a Black person before. Now, this was an interview I conducted with Safi, who was based in a Bristol nursery. And for me to hear that in, as I said earlier, what seems to be a very diverse, a very multicultural city, to know that a child can go to 3 or 4 years of age and perhaps not have seen a Black person before, it speaks to perhaps a broader issue that's at play in particularly segregated areas within the city, perhaps across the UK as well. My proposal for this research specifically in this journal article was therefore that research in later education has shown that Black teachers, through their identity, do bring specific life experiences and strengths that benefit children, namely through co-identification and the value of representation that I spoke about earlier. It's crude to position all Black educators as models of some kind of acceptable Blackness. However, recognising that these educators may inevitably model some kind of Blackness in learning environments, and more positively can play some kind of role in mediating whiteness, may ultimately provide valuable insight into the ways in which we understand the construction of identity. Just a couple of things to emphasise that. Of course, not saying that all Black educators are going to challenge whiteness. Black people are not a homogenous group, but inevitably there will be some Black educators that are more open and perhaps more forthcoming with issues of representation and aware of their own racial identities and the value that that can bring, and ultimately can play some kind of role in mediating whiteness in early childhood settings. Methodologically then, I worked with critical race theory to understand participants' narratives, which I really positioned as counter-narratives against the normative, implicitly white experiences of those working within the profession. I drew those counter-narratives together with narrative analysis to explore the experiences of Black educators in the early years. I'll just share a second small snippet finding here from Mandy. Mandy is someone I think I'll remember fondly from our interview together. We had lots of fun and lots of laughs, and she gave me some really good insight into what it was like to be a Black educator in the city and the experiences of tokenism and being a minority among a predominantly white profession where she was based. And this is just a very small snippet from the conversation with Mandy, where I say to her, and I'm glad you've said yes to being interviewed for the study. She says, well, there's not many Black people to ask in this place, is there? We both laughed and kind of shared that moment because I think we were both implicitly aware that it spoke to a much broader issue at play, and that was ultimately teased out through the later research and findings. So as I said, I'd encourage you to read the findings in your own time, but my conclusion was ultimately that moving beyond this notion of race as something that's perhaps irrelevant or inappropriate at this level of education towards a more critically informed understanding of what kinds of influence that minoritised educators can have is crucial in addressing experiences of racism in educational spaces. Black studies remains a relatively new field in academia, and the paucity of research on the Black educator in early childhood, combined with the data presented, therefore justifies a need to continue to focus on the experiences of those within the profession. I have since gone on to do some more analysis of my findings in subsequent papers, and of course this research has informed the rationale for the study that Mona's now going to explain in a little bit more depth. So Mona, if you're there, I'll hand over to you at this point.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Shadow. That was absolutely fascinating. It's one thing to see the slides. It's another thing entirely to hear you talking through them. That was really thought-provoking. And I'm excited about the discussion and the dialogue that we're going to have around some of those ideas later. As Shaddai mentioned, we're very much going to keep this kind of quite tight so that we can maximize the time that we have for dialogue and discussion in today's session, because we really want to value people's experiences and perspectives and comments, and not just kind of questions that have us talking some more. So as Shaddai said, his work is a huge part of the rationale that underpins this research that was kindly funded and supported by BERA on ethnicity in the early years workforce, and more specifically a census of staff in maintained nursery schools in England. Now, I should start by talking a little bit about that rationale, you know, where this research is coming from. It comes definitely from that kind of qualitative perspective and framework that Shaddai was talking about. You know, that's its birth, that's its essence. But that relates to what we see as a paucity of not just qualitative research in this area, but quantitative research in this field. So, for example, the Department for Education, for many years, in doing their survey of childcare providers, did not collect data around the ethnicity of the workforce. And we were working with absolutely no data on the ethnicity of the early years workforce. More recently, they came around to the idea of collecting some very baseline, basic data on the ethnicity of the early years workforce, to the extent where they can give percentages of the entire workforce in relation to categories of ethnicity. But that hides, as we know, so much. It doesn't tell us anything about how ethnicity intersects with qualification levels of professionals within the sector. It doesn't tell us anything about how ethnicity intersects with leadership and management responsibilities within the sector. And it also doesn't tell us how the ethnicity of staff within settings actually relates to the ethnicity of the children and the families that are accessing provision within those settings. So the DFE have not kind of recognized that there is a huge gap in the data that we are collecting at a national level currently around early years provision. Now, this research project is a modest, tiny step towards kind of countering that gap, that significant gap that exists. We didn't have, unfortunately, the funds to do an entire census of the entire early years workforce. But what we decided to do is instead to focus on the staff in the 385 maintained nursery schools across England, a dwindling number though, as we speak, and to try and get in there and ask some of those questions about representation. So how does the staff body relate to children and families in that setting? How does the ethnicity intersect with leadership responsibilities, and how does it intersect with qualification? So these are kind of humble offerings, you know. Shaddai's work is far more thought-provoking in some ways, and far more insightful when we're thinking about ethnicity in the early years workforce. But we have to do something to counter the lack of data that we have at a national level when it comes to ethnicity and the early years workforce. Now, I can't go any further in talking about this research without first kind of acknowledging how many people have actually been involved in this research and have made it possible. So while the core research team is myself and two wonderful research assistants, Magda and Selena, we had the most incredible advisory group supporting us all of the way through this project. Shaddai was one member of the advisory group, but it's important to take the time to acknowledge not just Shaddai's contribution, but also the contribution of Liz Pemberton, CEO of the Black Nursery Manager, Dr. Valerie Daniel, Executive Head Teacher for 2 Birmingham maintained nursery schools, Dr. Sarah Bonetti, Early Years Workforce Researcher at Education Policy Institute, and Dr. Beatrice Merrick, who's the CEO of Early Education. Collectively, the insights, the experiences, the perspectives have all been such a rich part of doing this research, and really the research wouldn't have happened without all of that input. Of course, we also need to thank and show gratitude to all of the nursery school head teachers that took the time in an extremely busy season to actually respond to our research request for participation, and then all of the staff within their settings who followed through with the data that we needed in order to contribute a census that was robust enough that we could actually draw some conclusions around ethnicity, leadership, representation, qualification levels. Now, in terms of our kind of research process, I am holding my hands up that this is a very kind of blunt, quantitative baseline approach. Okay, so we really had to work within the constraints of extremely busy nursery schools to ask some extremely blunt questions about ethnicity and those things that I mentioned, the leadership, the children's ethnicity, and qualification levels. So we reached out to all 385 nursery schools across England and pleaded with them to participate in this census. We did that through email, we did that through phone calls, and in the end, we ended up with 95 schools that signed up. Many more schools said they would have liked to have done it, but that time pressures wouldn't allow for it. But we ended up with 95 schools, which was amazing. And then within those 95 schools, we had individual responses to the research from 490 staff members. So the way that this worked is essentially we would make contact with the head teacher of the setting, and once they were on board, they would send us some basic data around the children and the families accessing provision at their setting. This is publicly available data that they can draw down. So this is collected at a national level. They could draw down on that data, feed that data over to us, along with some basic information about their school, such as how many staff, how many teaching staff they had within their setting. And by teaching staff, I don't just mean qualified teachers. I mean any staff member that's coming into kind of direct contact with children. Okay, so essentially everybody but maybe a member of admin staff or potentially a lunchtime supervisor. The head teacher would then pass on a survey link to individual staff members who would complete a 2-minute survey, choosing an ethnic category that they self-identified as, and then sharing their highest qualification level, their leadership and management responsibilities, and that was it. So they would complete those 3 questions and then submit these responses to us. These were all anonymized. The only thing we needed to be able to do was to link responses back to data provided by head teachers in order to look at that issue of representation across staff and children. So what I'm now going to do is present the findings, but these are kind of blunt graphs. They're there to get us talking and thinking and probing. And I'm going to stay very much with the numbers. The reason being that we did not, and so far have not done, the data collection necessary to really probe into the why and the how of these findings. Okay, so this research was designed to kind of fill that gap around quantitative data in terms of ethnicity in the early years workforce. And I'm happy to say, undertaking qualitative research at the moment, an analysis of that qualitative research to really probe why, according to the sector, we have the findings that we have. Okay, so bear with me, I'll keep this very much at the numbers. What do the numbers tell us? And then within the dialogue together, we can really start to unpick what those numbers are saying, and also linking back to kind of Shadai's perspective that he so kindly offered. So in terms of children and staff, now of the 95 nursery schools that signed up to be part of this data collection, what we found is that the children and the families of those settings were markedly more diverse than the staff within those settings. Now, it's really interesting in itself that the children served by these settings are very diverse. So in fact, less than half of the children within the settings collectively were kind of categorized according to this publicly available information as white. Now, if you compare that with kind of national statistics around ethnicity, that suggests that the sample of children are far more diverse, which is interesting methodologically because it suggests perhaps that those who wanted to get on board with this research, those head teachers that said yes, were working in settings where they were perhaps more aware of ethnicity, thinking about ethnicity and diversity within their day-to-day context far more. Just putting that out there as a possibility, but we seem to have kind of an element of self-selection in the sample in that respect. So while fewer than 50% of the children within these settings were white, 72% of the staff that we surveyed within these settings self-identified as white. So we can see that there is a big difference in terms of the diversity of the children and the diversity of the practitioners. And we can break that down kind of and look at individual ethnicity differences in a lot more detail, but that's the kind of headline. Okay, we've got children and families who are more diverse than the staff in these settings. And that completely riffs off of Shadai's kind of qualitative findings and also the statistical findings for other parts of the education sector, whether that's higher education, whether that's secondary school, whether that's primary school. But we didn't actually have this data and still don't to the extent that we would like to have it in relation to early years education. So we do have an issue with representation. This is what this graph seems to be suggesting. The next thing that we can take a look at is around ethnicity and the intersection with qualifications. And with what we get here is a really interesting and concerning picture around that intersection, whereby the higher the level of qualification among staff, the less diverse that group of staff appear to be. Okay, so you can see here on the graph that when we're looking at QTS, there is a marked lack of diversity there in terms of the broad ethnic categories. And so particularly within maintained nursery schools where there is, a prevalence of teachers with QTS, there is an issue there. Much less of an issue though when we take a look at level 3 and those who have a level 3 early childhood education and care qualification. And so we see this pattern whereby it seems to be the case that as you progress up the qualification levels within early years education, that diversity is dropping off. Now we see something similar, but a little bit more nuanced when we think about management responsibilities and kind of leadership levels within the nursery school. So just as with the QTS, we see a marked lack of diversity when we're thinking about senior management. So this is essentially the head teacher of the nursery school and the deputy head teacher of the nursery school. There we're looking at low percentages of those who self-identified in categories that broadly sit within Asian and Asian British, within mixed ethnicity, and within Black ethnicities. Whereas, interestingly, both within the non-leadership teaching role and the middle management roles too, the diversity appears to be perhaps less of an issue. So particularly interesting, I think, is that going from the non-leadership teaching role to a middle management role, so for example, being a preschool room leader within the nursery school, that doesn't seem to be perhaps such a barrier or such a hurdle to cross, but then getting into senior management seems to be a real challenge. And I'm not going to share findings from our qualitative research so far, because we're still in the process of analysing some fabulous interview data from about 20 head teachers of nursery schools. But these interviews, just to give you a kind of taste, they really start to unpick what is going on there, from that leap from middle management to senior management. What is happening to diversity? What are the barriers? What are the hurdles? What are the challenges that particular individuals are facing that then has this knock-on impact when we're looking at statistics like this? So I said I'd just kind of stay with the numbers and hopefully use this as the basis for conversation, for dialogue, and for digging a bit deeper. In terms of thinking about kind of the next steps, there's a lot to be done in this kind of field around the issue of ethnicity and early years workforce. We are just scratching the surface, really, of understanding what's happening and trying to kind of unpick that. We desperately need more quantitative research. So honestly, we kind of put out our report for BERA around maintained nursery schools and the census that we've managed to do as an invitation for others to kind of pick up the mantle and do quantitative research. And honestly, the only body that can effectively do this is the Department for Education. And so really it's an invitation and a plea to look not just at maintained nursery schools, which are a drop in the ocean. We all know that they're a drop in the ocean in terms of early years education within an English context. We need to be looking at PVIs, who provide the vast majority of places in early childhood education and care. And we need to be looking at ethnicity in the workforce in a much more comprehensive way, but with this level of nuance. So it's not okay to continue with these annual surveys conducted by the Department for Education that sweep away the nuance around leadership and management, around qualification levels, around issues of representation. We really need to start to bring those questions into our national data gathering if we are to stand on sure footing in terms of thinking about kind of further questions, but also potential interventions that we want to make. We also, of course, need more in-depth qualitative research of the kind that Shaddai and others are doing. But this is absolutely vital if we're going to probe what these quantitative findings are showing. And so, as I mentioned before, we're currently analysing a gamut of interviews with nursery school head teachers, which are explicitly probing these issues around qualification levels and climbing the leadership ladder and the barriers that individuals are encountering when it comes to climbing the leadership ladder within early years. I also think that we need to keep on going back to this issue of representation, and we need to early years-ize it, if I can introduce that word into the vocabulary. So, you know, Shaddai talks with so much consideration and thought and passion about representation and why representation matters on an educational level. And I think we need to continue as a sector to turn towards that issue of representation and work out what it means for us, and particularly what it means for us pedagogically. Early years is special within education because we don't shy away from the word pedagogy and all of its kind of richness, and we don't shy away from the idea of a social pedagogy. And so within a social pedagogy, we need to have a really kind of conscious discussion about where representation sits within that, how it works, what it is, what it means to us. And so these are some of the next steps that Shaddai and I kind of put out there as ideas for what might be the next kind of maneuvers within this sphere. And then I'm going to hand back to Shaddai now, who's just going to kind of offer up some prompts for us to think about
Yeah, thanks, Mona. It was, yeah, likewise, really nice to listen to that report and hear a bit more about the findings in further depth. As we said at the start, this is a dialogue, so we're now really interested in your thoughts and reflections on this report. I believe Louise is going to pop back on screen in a second, perhaps. For us, we're really interested in where you think the findings of the study might take us. Perhaps if there's anything we haven't considered, or how we might keep this conversation going, how we might early years eyes it, as Mona said, and develop that nuance in further depth, perhaps in other professions, other sectors of the early years, whether that's beyond maintained nursery schools or whatever. So Louise, I don't know if you're there or not, but hopefully you can take over for me and we can facilitate some discussion between participants in the audience.
I am here. Thank you, Shaddai. Mona, that was so interesting and such important work. I think the fact that, you know, you're collecting this data now, we have like a baseline historical record that can be used, you know, for future research to see if this picture actually changes in any way in the future, which hopefully it will. I do have a couple of questions. So the first one from David Chatterjee is a more methodological question. On average, how long did the survey take to complete for each school member? So I don't know if Mona wants to come in there and answer that
Sure,
one.
we made it as quick as possible. So the head teacher survey, when we looked at the kind of records of participation, on average, the head teacher survey took just under 3 minutes to complete. And the participant, so the staff member survey, which was even briefer, just 3 questions, each with a drop-down menu, on average took just over 2 minutes to complete. We advertised each as kind of 5 minutes, but we were being conservative in the end because people kind of whizzed through.
Thank you, Mona. And then another question from Nikki. How might the Department for Education be mobilised to see these kind of statistics are important to develop further conversations on ethnicity and representation?
Should I take that? Yeah, I wonder how the Department of Education might be mobilised on anything, but that's a broader question. Certainly for me, I think we need to be raising the voice and ensuring that these conversations are happening within the early years community. We're really fortunate that we've got Beatrice Merrick on board for early education, and this is an issue that we're going to continue to have and ensure that those conversations are happening. There's no reason that the statistics can't be done and the measurements can't be done on a yearly basis. We know it's important. We just need to outline the argument on representation as clearly as possible, and hopefully in future there will be some response and they will start to listen and really start to think seriously about the nature of race and racism in the early years.
Absolutely. If I could, yeah, I'd love to follow on from that, because it's a difficult one in that I don't want to fall into a pit of despair, and that I want to stay kind of positive enough, because I do really think that there may be a connection here, a connection point, which is around exactly as Shaddai was saying, representation. So if you can show that representation matters, and if you can show that it matters for the kind of outcomes that the DFE are kind of fixating on, then the hope is then that you can push through these agendas to at least discuss these issues and talk about these things and collect the data that we need to be collecting in order to have the discussions. There is hope there, but it's a really, you know, I'm not going to shy away from the fact that it's a really tricky landscape at the moment in terms of the politicization. Well, it is political, representation is political, but the way in which it is being used, and a kind of the culture wars within which we are unfortunately finding ourselves do make it really difficult to kind of find those points of connection, but they are absolutely there. I think we just need to be creative and collaborative and really try to kind of rise above some of what's happening at the moment.
Thank you, Mona. Can I come in with a question? And I do apologise in advance if it's clumsily presented, but I was thinking about what Shaddai was saying earlier on in his presentation about the, you know, the very low numbers of Black colleagues who are working in HE. and collecting research, and this sort of builds on your point, Mona. And I remember having, I have 2 Black colleagues in our department in Sheffield, and they're doing work on young Black men not actually getting the outcomes from their degree, despite coming in at the same level after their A-levels as their white peers. And I was blown away by the fact that, you know, this is actually happening in HE. No one had actually bothered previously to look at what was going on for these young Black men. And one of my colleagues, we had quite a kind of open conversation about issues of race and identity. And one of my colleagues said to me, Louise, we can't do this on our own. And I think for me, the discomfort is that kind of doing research as a white person in this kind of landscape of race. And you know, it's uncomfortable. And I'm not going to lie about that. It's uncomfortable. So I think my question is, what can we do to help? But obviously maintain that kind of positionality of the fact that we don't understand, you know, everything about, well, we don't understand what it's like to be Black if we are a white person. So I'm sorry if that was clumsily worded. It was just something that was formulating in my head as you were both speaking. So what can we do to help in terms of collecting this kind of data?
Shall I start off with that? Thank you for that question, Louise. I thought, yeah, it's a really good point. I think as you're kind of gesturing towards, it feeds into the nature of the awarding gap that we've been discussing from lecturers to students over the past few years. It's been a real issue. Some of the universities that I've been working on, that we need to recognise our own biases as academics, perhaps, when we're working with particular groups of students, and how that can affect how we see them in terms of their academic success. It's absolutely the same in the early years as it is in higher education when we look at the outcomes at stage 4 and 5 with the testing and measurements there. It's a similar thing. So that's a really good point, and I'm really keen to make this an issue across education, in higher education, secondary, primary and early years, and linking that up as a cohesive goal for me feels really, really important. I think your second point, what I'll say is racism harms us all, essentially, whether you're Black or white, and that's the bottom line. And it's really important that as much as we recognise our own identities and privileges, we do all get involved and have an understanding of how no one benefits from issues of race and racism in earlier society, and in early years and in society. The quicker we recognise that and come together and work cohesively, the better, I think. So there is that sense in which some white people can be tentative to get involved because they think they're not stepping on someone's feet. But actually, the more you raise your voice and the more you feel comfortable and confident in having those conversations, the better for all of us, I think, on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. I think I'm kind of thinking maybe it's just personality that means I'm prepared to wade into anything whenever, and that's not necessarily a good thing. But it's really interesting, isn't it, how frankly can we talk, how open can we be about issues of race and ethnicity, and how much silencing happens even without kind of necessarily wanting it to. So I'm thinking about kind of teaching on an MA where I lead a unit on critical race theory, and within that I have particularly high levels of ethnic diversity within the students doing that course, but they will really struggle to say to me, Mona, the teaching team for this MA are all white. Is that not a problem? We're talking about the statistics around HE professors, but like this is it, we're living it, right? But they can't bring themselves, or it feels like, without me saying, we're all white, aren't we? Isn't that an issue? They don't want to kind of say something that rocks the boat. And that is exactly that silencing, I think, that kind of embedded like white fragility within our culture, that we can't even say what is so obvious, And so, for example, in the research that we've recently been doing with head teachers, one head teacher turned around to us and said, but your research team, how diverse are you? And we could say, we're not. That's a problem. How is it a problem? Let's talk about it. Let's think about it. So I'm not saying that dialogue and discussion is enough, but surely it's a starting point. Surely being able to kind of recognize that race and ethnicity are kind of rattling through all of our experiences, not just the experiences of those who are in a minority in a particular situation, but that actually it's kind of up for discussion among everybody. That's hopefully a starting point, and that there can be an openness without being offensive. I think that's what I'd hope.
Emma DeBerry's got a really good book called What White People Can Do Next, and it touches directly on some of those issues. So I'd really recommend that if you're interested in finding out a bit more.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. What was the name of the book, Shada?
Called What White People Can Do Next, and it's by Emma DeBerry.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. Let's have a look. I've got another question. I've got a comment from Bini, I'm hoping I'm saying that name correctly, who says, well said, Shada, racism does harm us all. And then a question. This is, and she starts, this is probably an unfair question, but is there a political will to diversify the ECEC workforce as well as the teacher workforce? Going on to say, I have completed race training for the Department for Education teacher recruitment staff, and I wonder if more needs to be offered to the department to support them in this area.
Yeah, I'd agree with both points. So we kind of need to extend things that are available at other levels of education currently. I mean, yes, other things are being done at other levels of education, probably not enough and not quickly enough. But even then within that, there are things that early years, I think, could be using much more effectively. So to give an example, you know, that Ofsted have leadership development specifically targeting ethnic minority educators who are kind of working towards leadership positions. That is open to early years educators. But when you look at the kind of numbers of early years educators turned leaders who go through it, it's really too small. And so we have a job to do in saying, hang on a second, as always, early years is part of education. All of these things that are available to the rest of education need to come into early years. It is a more complex landscape because so much of it is not state provided, but we have to kind of see it as part of the entire project.
Yeah, I would agree with Mona. Absolutely, more training is needed. Just shout out Liz Pemberton now, I guess, the Black Nursery Manager, who's done some fantastic work in anti-racism in the early years. Certainly in terms of leadership training for Black practitioners and developing that understanding, that also feels really, really important to me. And developing more of a curriculum approach towards anti-racism, more of a framework than perhaps what we're currently seeing in the current early years. Revised early years framework, and you know, Birth to Five Matters goes some way towards addressing that, but I think even more work can be done towards developing a cohesive framework and guidance document for practitioners to follow. Laura Henry's got a really good document out, The Tiny Guide to Anti-Racism. So there are resources out there, but perhaps it could be more consistent, and perhaps support from the Department for Education could enable us to do that as well. And again, that goes back to the nature of needing to have a dialogue between us and governmental bodies on these issues.
Thank you, Shadai. Question from Patricia. Did your research include discussion of staff recruitment and any specific efforts to diversify the workforce in any of the nurseries?
Yeah, watch this space, because the qualitative follow-ups absolutely does. So essentially in the qualitative follow-up research, we've gone back to the head teachers and said, will you just chat with us about the findings? Will you make sense of these findings together with us and give us your thoughts and perspectives? And recruitment is a kind of key topic within those conversations and within that thinking, and how recruitment practices do or don't support diversity within the workforce of a particular setting, how recruitment practices have been designed in order to kind of enable a more diverse workforce to be there and to be part of the setting. So I don't have a kind of a neat answer around that, other than to say, yeah, watch this space, because we will absolutely be publishing in the near future some really interesting findings around that.
Teasing us with that. I want to see it now, that data.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, I haven't had any more questions in. So Nikki, can I hand back to you to sum up?
Definitely can. I had a question. I was just rapidly typing in as we go because I was really fascinated, Mona, by your conversation around how we can try and promote more diverse recruitment. I was wondering, and this probably is in your qualitative data as well, does that also apply to those who are looking for leadership positions, or who are looking to be promoted from maybe room leader to nursery manager, or those sorts of things? I don't know if that's part of something you've considered.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fair for me to say what's coming out and what's really fascinating is not just kind of the extras that might be done to support that kind of move into senior management, but I would flip it and say what's really concerning is the amount of hostility that some individuals have experienced on their journey to leadership. So we are talking to nursery school head teachers, but it is a really, there's no level playing field here, or that's very much the sense coming through from the interviews, is this is not just a case of what can be done to support people's progression through, but actually what awful barriers and what really, shocking hurdles need to be removed in order to allow people to progress into leadership positions. So the recruitment is a kind of, it is perhaps less shocking. There's more around kind of what we're doing. This is how we're thinking about it. But when it comes to individual leadership journeys, the kind of the hostility that we're seeing within people's experiences, the discrimination, the prejudice, the ways in which that plays out, the silencing that plays out day to day, that seems to be much more of the focus, I think.
Thank you, Mona. Shaddai, did you want to add anything from your own research, maybe?
Yeah, it was similar findings from my research, actually. I'm thinking back to one practitioner who had been in the profession for maybe 20 or 30 years, and the barriers that she had faced that she hadn't simply been able to express before we'd had this conversation. I think back to it again, and it was really affective in terms of that moment that we had to speak with each other, because we just hadn't spoken about race and racism before. She hadn't felt that she had anyone to turn to. And when you're in that career for so long, for 10, 15, 20 years, it's constant knockbacks and you're not getting promoted to those leadership positions. It's debilitating, and it's incredibly difficult for one's own mental health. And you can't ignore the racialized aspect of that, I think, and that's something that really shone through for me. So how we flip that and look at where it's going well and those positive recruitment strategies for diversity, for me, that's really, really important.
Thank you both. And I've listened intently to what you've been saying, and it's been really important to start to have some of these discussions. And I've shared your work on Twitter, Shaddai, because I think it's really important that, again, that people engage with those papers and start to really question and think about these things themselves. So we're just about to finish the event off here, and I would like to warmly thank Shaddai and Mona for sharing their research so far. I think it's the start of a really important conversation that we need to have in the early childhood education and care sector. And I know it's one that practitioners, and you mentioned Liz Pemberton and Valerie Daniels, already started to have in the broader sector along with yourselves, and I think and Laura Henry Elaine as well. So I just think we need to keep those conversations going, and we need to start questioning ourselves as well as white educators and white researchers as to how we can work collaboratively and collegially with our Black or our Asian or our other minority ethnic colleagues to try and share those experiences and be part of some of these things moving forwards. And I know that Vinny had to leave, but Vinny Land has done a lot of work in race and deeper education as well. So it's just trying to sort of learn from research that's out there already, and your work, Shaddai, and Mona, the study that you're doing at the moment, to try and move forwards and think differently about race and representation and why it's so important in early childhood. So I'd like to draw this event to a close by thanking you both for your provocations, for sharing your research, for making us think more broadly. I've already Googled those books you talked about, and I've sent myself an email to remind myself to look at them in the library. But I think we do need to start to engage more broadly and think around critical race theory and the potential it has to help us understand why some of these things are happening and what we can do about that. We're looking forward to your papers and research as they come out. So thank you again very much for your time. I'd like to draw this webinar to a close. For those of you that are here, it will be recorded in case you want to go back and relook at what's been happening. And for those that join the recording, please do engage with the research that's been spoken about, and we hope you enjoy the session. So thank you all very much. Have a lovely afternoon and evening, and we look forward to the next webinar series.